The truest craftsmanship is a dialogue with wood. You do not command it, you listen. You learn the language of its grain, the tension in its fibres, the story of its growth. A master builder hears the future grown in a timber. He knows where the weight will settle, where the cold will conspire with contraction to create a flaw. His work is not to fight nature, but to outthink it, to build a companion for the storm. There was such a man. They said his cabin held warmth like a secret. It stood near a frozen river, a testament to quiet defiance. Yakov learned from a collapse. As a boy, he saw snow deliver its verdict on a poorly made roof, saw stillness where there should have been breath. He did not look away. He made memory his first tool. He apprenticed under an old carpenter whose hands were maps of a lifetime of wrestling with trees. The old man taught him patience, that wood must be courted, seasoned, understood, that a joint is a promise between two pieces. A well-made home is not a shield, but a wise opponent. It yields where it must, stands firm where it can, and speaks clearly when it is under stress. Yakov built his own cabin with the gravity of a vow. He laid stones for a foundation, a courtesy to the earth. He fitted each log as if matching puzzle pieces carved by the forest itself. His innovation was not grandeur, but foresight. Braces that could be tightened, a roof that could negotiate with accumulating snow. His wife, Agrafena, watched this meticulous ritual. She saw it for what it was. Not obsession, but love rendered in timber and mortar. A love that whispered, asterisk. You will be safe here, asterisk. Winter tested that promise. The worst storm arrived not with a roar, but with a gathering siege of white. Then, the sound. A sharp, dry crack from above, the voice of a beam pushed beyond its limit. In the frozen dark, the arithmetic of survival changed. Flight into the blizzard was likely death, stay, and risk being buried alive. Yakov did not run. He looked up at the groaning timber, then at his family huddled in the corner. He reached for his theory, the adjustable braces. With a mallet in the shuddering light, he drove wedges deeper. Each strike was an argument against gravity. Agrafena shielded their children, her body a final barrier. The boy, Nikolai, watched, his childhood ending in the shadow of his father's focused terror. The brace took the strain, the cracking ceased. The storm raged for 2 more days, and Yakov and his son climbed the treacherous roof to lighten its load. They fought not with strength, but with endurance. When the sky finally cleared, a fracture ran through the beam, a scar, not a death sentence. His preparation had held. After that, no one called him overly cautious. They came to learn. He shared his knowledge without pride, for on the frontier, wisdom was too precious to hoard. It was a currency of life. He taught that a home must be honest, that its bones should be visible, its weaknesses knowable. His legacy was not a single cabin, but a pattern of safety that spread through the settlements. A daughter took his drawings to a new home, a son built with the same principles. His love, built into wood and stone, outlived his hands. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Scattered across museums are quiet mysteries, iron charms cold to the touch. They bear symbols that resist translation, a stylized sun, a branching tree, geometries of protection. They were found placed with intention, by doorways, under thresholds, cradled in walls. Not hidden, but asterisk, present asterisk. What were they? Practical magic? A prayer made solid? They were too valuable to be mere ornament. Perhaps they were a language for speaking to the fear that firewood could not address. A way to mark the boundary between the fragile kingdom of warmth and the endless, hungry cold. A ritual to complete the checklist of survival. Asterisk. Check the latch, feed the fire, touch the iron. Now, perhaps you may rest. Archaeologists find other whispers. Threshold pits, small and lined with stone, kept meticulously clear of snow. Evidence shows embers were placed there briefly. Why? To burn the boundary? To make a line of light the cold would not cross? To leave an offering of heat at the door, a bargain struck with the night? Then there are the stories, passed down in fragments, of the black cold, a cold that felt watchful, purposeful. that carried a scent of iron and stone, that made frost form in deliberate patterns on the asterisk inside asterisk of windows? Was it a folk tale born from isolation, or a collective memory of some profound atmospheric dread given a shape and a name? These practices lived alongside sharp empirical knowledge. The same settler who could predict a storm by the behaviour of birds might also leave a crust of bread by the door as an offering. This was not contradiction, it was completeness. The physical fight was measured in woodpiles and chinking. The psychological fight was measured in charms and rituals. One guarded the body, the other guarded the mind against the terror of an indifferent universe. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Far from the single-room cabins in the larger settlement stood houses of another order, the governor's residence, a fortress of timber and stone with multiple stoves, glass windows, carpets from distant lands. Here, winter was a muted inconvenience. Servants managed the thermodynamics. Breath did not fog the air in the drawing room. Dinner was served on porcelain. The cold was a rumour heard faintly through double-paned glass. Yet winter, in its ultimate expression, is a democratizer. The great storm of 1799 did not respect rank. Its cold infiltrated the stone foundations. Its winds found the floors in elegant construction. The mansion's many fireplaces became mouths, devouring the vast woodpile at a terrifying rate. For the first time, the governor faced the settler's calculation: which rooms to abandon to the freezing dark. His family slept huddled in the parlour, their privilege reduced to a shared fear. A servant, the son of a frontiersman, risked his life to clear an ice chimney, possessing the very skills the elite had never needed to learn. The storm passed. The social order reasserted itself. But a subtle knowledge had been exchanged. The elite understood, in their bones, that their comfort was a fragile construct. The common settler saw that even the powerful could be brought low by the same wind. For a few days they had all been equal before the cold. They had all been listeners in the long dark night. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The ice always thawed. Spring came with a slow, muddy inevitability. The world dripped and sang. Life shifted from defence to accumulation. But the memory of winter was seared into the rhythm of existence. Every summer action was a preposition for the cold to come. Every stored jar, every stacked log was a word in next season's story of survival. Their struggle is silent now. Their cabins are dust. Return to the forest. The iron charms sit in museum cases, their exact meaning faded, but the essence remains. It is the feeling of being the lone sentinel, the understanding that safety is not a given, but a continuous conscious act. It is the weight of a sleeping child's breath, and the knowledge that you are the wall between that breath and the void. We live in a world of assured warmth, of central heating and weather satellites. We have tamed the winter, and in that triumph we may have forgotten the texture of that particular vigilance, the profound clarity that comes when your entire purpose is to keep a flame alive. So as you settle into your own certainty tonight, let the memory of their long vigil be a quiet monument, not to hardship, but to attention, to the love that manifests as a well-made joint, a stocked larder, a watchful eye in the deep dark. Their night has ended. Yours is safe and warm. Let sleep come not as a retreat but as a gift they help to build. Dream not of the cold but of the enduring ember.
You must decide whether to light a fire. Fire means warmth, means being able to heat water or cook dried provisions, means light pushing the darkness back a few feet. But fire also means smoke and light. means announcing your presence to anyone on the road or nearby. Most nights, you will choose fire. The risk of being discovered is outweighed, in the end, by the desperate need for warmth and the small comfort of illumination. But you will keep the fire small, feeding it carefully with the driest wood you can find, keeping the flames low and contained. The wood gathered in the twilight is often damp, the driest twigs still cold to the touch. You arrange the wood with hands stiff from gripping reins or clenching against the cold. The first attempts at ignition often fail. When the flame finally catches, it is not a roaring blaze from a hearth, but a tentative, flickering thing requiring constant attention. You feed it only one piece at a time, not allowing it to become large enough to consume fuel quickly, nor to weaken so much that ray lighting it becomes an ordeal. The circle of light it creates is startlingly small, perhaps 6 feet, maybe 8 if the fire is generous. Beyond that circle, the darkness is absolute, not the comfortable dark of a room, but a living, pressing dark that seems to have weight and texture. Your food is whatever is durable, whatever will not spoil hardtack, dried meat, a little cheese if the journey is newly begun. You eat without pleasure, only to satisfy the body's need to continue tomorrow, barely tasting it because the cold has numbed your tongue, and the darkness makes the familiar food strange. Water is a constant worry. You drink from a canteen or a skin rationing because the last water source is behind you and you do not know when you will find another tomorrow. The water tastes of its container, leather and metal, is never enough to truly quench thirst and must be made to last. If you have a blanket, you pull it over your shoulders and draw close to the fire, feeling one side grow warm while the other grows steadily colder. If you have no blanket, you pull your coat tight and accept that you will not be truly warm until you are moving again in the morning. Sleep is necessary but difficult to obtain. The ground is hard beneath you, every root and stone announcing itself through your clothes. You shift, trying to find a position that doesn't involve a painful contact with the earth, but there is no such position. The sounds of the forest at night are entirely different from those of the day. There are movements in the dark, certainly animals, which you cannot see, only guess it from rustles, snaps, and occasional calls. Your mind supplies possibilities: deer, raccoon, fox, bear. It is probably deer, but is almost certainly deer. That the dark makes all confirmation impossible. So, you listen with every part of you, trying to judge distance and direction by sound alone. Your body is exhausted, but your mind refuses to let you sleep. Every sound demands attention, requires analysis. Is that a footstep? Is something approaching? Is it just the wind or something else? Time passes in this state, not awake, not asleep, suspended in a space with blurry boundaries where time loses meaning and the dark seems eternal. Fire weakens. You rouse yourself to add a piece of wood and then return to the vigil. The cold increases. This is the coldest part of the night, the hour before dawn, when the earth has given up all the warmth stored from the day and the sun has not yet returned to give more. You pull your knees up, hug yourself, conserving the small heat your body still produces. Stillness brings out the pains joints ache from sitting. Your back protests the awkward posture. Your neck is stiff, your shoulders tight with unreleased tension. Every part of you wants to move, to walk, to generate heat through action. But movement in the dark is another kind of danger. The road is still out there somewhere beyond the firelight, but in the dark, it becomes unreliable, untrustworthy. Ruts easily seen by day become traps for ankles and wheels. A broken branch easily avoided becomes an invisible obstacle that can lame a horse or send a traveler sprawling. Can you even be sure of the road itself anymore? By day, you could see how the path wound around trees, followed the land's contours, maintained a relatively consistent width and direction. But at night, even with a lantern, you can see only a few feet ahead, with no way to know if the path goes straight, forks, or simply ends. Travelers tell stories of those who tried to push on in the dark, men who drove off the road in the blackness and spent 3 days extracting a wagon from a ditch, a messenger who missed a turn and added 50 unnecessary miles, a family who traveled all night, arriving at dawn at a place with known aim and no road in sight. The stories are told matter minus of minus factly, without embellishment, in a tone that states a simple truth. They need no dramatization because the consequences speak for themselves: wasted time, lost resources, danger incurred simply by refusing to stop. So you stop. Every traveler stops. The rhythm of travel in this time and place is not determined by will or need, but by the sun. You move when light permits, and you stop when darkness makes movement foolish. Your progress toward your destination will resume tomorrow. Tonight, you exist only in the small space between one day's travel and the next, maintaining the flame, maintaining yourself, waiting for the sky to lighten enough to release you back onto the road. The stars, if you can see them through the canopy, offer no comfort. They are beautiful, yes, a clear sky full of cold points of light, but they illuminate nothing useful, cast no light on the path ahead, offer no guidance to follow. They are simply there, distant and indifferent to your small concerns. You think about the destination, the inn or town or home waiting at the journey's end. You calculate how many more days of this, 3, if the weather holds, maybe 4. Each day repeating the same pattern: waking in the cold, moving in the light, stopping when the dark forces it, enduring the long night. As you flex your fingers, they are stiff and slow, the joints unwilling to bend fully. You hardly notice it in the day, but now in stillness, every small discomfort announces itself. Your feet ache with a dull, constant pain, perhaps simple fatigue, perhaps the beginning of something worse: blisters forming, toes numbed by dampened cold. You remove your boots to check, airing your feet by the fire, but the process is clumsy and leaves your feet exposed to the cold air, stinging. Your socks, if you have socks, are damp with sweat and the wet that has seeped to the leather. You hold them near the flames, trying to dry them without burning them, then hurry to pull socks and boots back on before your feet lose what little warmth they had. This is the reality of travel in that time. Not the adventure or a romance imagined from afar, but a series of small, grinding discomforts that accumulate until they are your entire world. When your back aches constantly, your stomach is never truly full, and the cold is so deep in your bones you can't remember what it feels like to be truly warm, there is no romance. Your mind wanders as you stare at the flames. You think of the people you are going to see, the business that requires your presence, or the home you left and when you might see it again. The thoughts are not sharp or urgent, they drift through your mind with the same soft, vague quality as the smoke rising from the fire. The night is long, impossibly long. Every hour stretches out until you are certain dawn must be near. Then you realize there is no hint of light in the eastern sky, and several hours remain. You have lost all sense of time's passage, unable to tell if you have been sitting here for 2 hours or 5. Your body, despite your mind's vigilance, tries to sleep. Your head nods forward, then jerks up. Your eyelids close heavily, then open with effort. Do you fall into a shallow sleep? The dreams barely distinguishable from your waking thoughts. The dreams eye of the road stretching on, of yourself walking, of a destination that remains always ahead. Finally, with a slowness that seems deliberate, the dark begins to thin. Not light, but the absolute black begins to lessen. The trees emerge as darker masses against the slightly less dark sky. Fire, which seemed so bright in the total dark, now seems dim and tired. You tend to it one last time, adding the final piece of wood to make enough flame for boiling water for what passes for breakfast. You eat quickly, efficiently, your mind already turning to the day ahead, to how far you can get before the scene repeats itself. In the gray light of dawn, as you return to the road, it looks no different from the evening before. The same ruts, the same mud, the same uncertain path extending into what seems like endless forest. But at least now you can see it well enough to follow. You begin to walk. After the cold stillness of the night, your body protests the movement, but gradually, motion brings warmth back to your limbs. The morning is quiet, only the sound of footsteps or, if you have a wagon, the creak of the axle. You fall back into the rhythm that will carry you through another day, until dusk comes again, the light begins to fail, and you must make the same decision you made yesterday to stop before the dark steals the road from beneath your feet. Case Josiah Gregg. There was a man named Josiah Gregg who recorded his travels on the Santa Fe Rail in the 1832s. His diaries were not narratives of dramatic adventure, but meticulous records of distances, conditions, and the constant recalculation of when to stop moving. Greg was a merchant by necessity and a writer by inclination, and he understood that the success of a journey depended more on accepting the limitations imposed by distance and darkness than on courage. He made multiple trips between Missouri and Santa Fe, leading wagon trains loaded with trade goods. Each journey taught him the same lesson: progress was measured by the camps established before dark, not by the miles forced through questionable light. His first crossing, when he was still learning the rhythm of overland travel, was full of mistakes that became lessons later. He wrote of a night when they pushed too far, trying to reach an own campsite that calculations suggested should be close, only to search for it in deepening dark. As visibility decreased, the wagon slowed. The oxen grew uncertain of the ground they could not see. The drivers grew tense, aware that wheels could break, animals could stumble, and the progress they gained by continuing could be multiplied and lost through repairs and recovery. They found the campsite eventually, but only after an hour of movement so slow it was almost equivalent to stopping. Drake calculated that they might have gained 2 miles at the cost of exhausted animals, frayed nerves, and a camp made in total blackness that left them unprepared for the night. He never made that mistake again. The diaries of his subsequent journeys show a pattern of stopping early, making camp while there was still enough light to gather firewood, arrange the wagons properly, and tend to the animals. The repetition in his records reveals the truth of travel: the same decision made every day, the same calculations of distance and daylight, the same acceptance that forward motion must cease when the sun decrees it. These records have no narrative arc, no building tension or dramatic resolution. Only day after day, a cumulative accretion measured in camps made, nights endured, mornings resumed. Greg traveled in late spring and summer when he could, timing his departures to avoid deep winter, but the nights were still cold enough to make sleep difficult. He described the practice of sleeping under the wagons, using the undercarriage as a sort of roof, the frame of wheels and axles providing psychological if not actual shelter. The ground under a wagon was no softer, the space cramped, but it created a defined space that felt less vulnerable than lying out in the open. Others in his train did the same, each person having their own small territory under their assigned wagon in the camp. When the terrain allowed, the campfire was built in the center of the circled wagons. When it did not, the position was chosen with care. The fire served multiple purposes: warmth, cooking, illumination of the immediate surroundings, and a psychological center that made the camp feel established, not temporary. Greg noted how conversation around the fire grew quieter as the night deepened, how people who talked freely during the day grew silent at night. It was not fear, but an alertness that did not permit full relaxation, an awareness that beyond the circle of firelight, they were small, isolated presences in a vast landscape. His descriptions of nights on the trail focus less on danger and more on discomfort and monotony. The hours between making camp and sleep were long, filled with small tasks to be completed, then waiting for the body to become tired enough to sleep despite the conditions. He wrote of the sounds of the prairie at night, the wind through grass, the occasional howl of a coyote, the movements of the oxen in their temporary pen. These sounds became familiar over his many trips, but familiarity did not bring comfort, only expected presence. Sleep was broken, interrupted by cold discomfort, or simply the difficulty of sleeping on hard ground after days of physical exertion. Greg described waking multiple times each night to check the fire, to look up at the sky for signs of dawn, to note the position of the stars to guess how long until travel resumed. The stars themselves became a sort of clock for him, their slow rotation across the sky marking the passage of time that otherwise, in the dark, became elastic and uncertain. He learned to recognize specific constellations and their positions at different hours of the night, using them to judge whether it was worth trying to sleep again or if dawn was near enough to begin preparations for the day. This astronomical timekeeping was imperfect, subject to clouds in his own tired judgment, but it gave the night a structure, made it feel less endless. Finding Orion had moved only a little since he last looked meant hours remained. A significant shift meant morning was coming. Like most travelers, his health suffered on these journeys. He recorded matter minus of minus faculty digestive troubles, persistent coughs, wounds that would not heal properly from the constant travel of day after day. He seemed to understand that the human body was not designed for the sustained hardship required by overland travel. Constant exposure to the elements, the poor nutrition available on the trail, the lack of true rest all accumulated into a baseline state of declining health that every traveler accepted as the cost of movement. Yet he kept traveling, because the trade he engaged in required his presence, and stopping meant the end of his livelihood. His diaries reveal a man with no romantic illusions about the trail, who knew exactly how difficult and uncomfortable each journey would be, but undertook them anyway because the alternative was poverty. The nightly stops were where the cost of travel accumulated most visibly. During the day, movement provided distraction and purpose. There was always the next landmark to reach, the next mile to conquer, visible progress in the changing landscape around you. But the night held only stillness and waiting, the slow passage of time that brought you no closer to your destination. The psychological weight of this enforced inactivity pressed heavily on men whose success was measured in miles covered and goods delivered. Greg recorded injuries that occurred even with careful stops, a man stepping on an unseen stone in the dark, badly twisting an ankle and having to ride in a wagon for 3 days instead of walking, another cutting his hand gathering wood in poor light, an infection lasting weeks, a driver becoming disoriented while checking on the animals in total darkness, falling into a shallow gully invisible in the blackness but deep enough to break a collarbone. These incidents were not dramatic, but they were consequential. Each injury slowed the train, required attention and care, reminded everyone that darkness turned even familiar tasks dangerous. Greg's records also show the economic accounting of the nightly stop. Each day not traveled was a day consuming supplies without progress. The animals needed to be fed, the men needed to eat, and these costs accumulated whether miles were covered or not. The supplies carried by the train were finite, and every pound consumed without corresponding progress reduced the margin for dealing with delays or emergencies. This created a constant pressure to maximize daylight hours, to start as early as possible and push as late as seemed safe. But Greg knew from experience that pushing too hard led to exhausted animals that required a full day of rest to recover, a cost greater than that of stopping early each day. Oxen were particularly vulnerable to overwork. They had great strength, but once depleted, they recovered slowly. An ox team pushed too hard would visibly slow, their gait changing from the steady pace that covered miles efficiently to a painful slog that barely qualified as forward motion. He developed a rhythm evident in his later diaries that he adhered to, rising before dawn, preparing in the dock with lanterns when necessary, beginning movement at first light, stopping with about 2 hours of good light remaining. These 2 hours were for establishing camp properly, tending the animals, cooking and eating, preparing thoroughly for the night rather than scrambling. This pattern maximized progress while minimizing the risks of moving or establishing camp in insufficient light. Was not dramatic or heroic, but it was sustainable. He could maintain this rhythm for weeks without the utter exhaustion or cumulative damage that a more aggressive schedule produced. His records of other travelers reveal the consequences of different approaches. Trains that insisted on traveling in darkness suffered more accidents, more exhaustion, more conflict among their members. The stress of navigating uncertain terrain in poor light made men irritable, careless, and carelessness on the trail was expensive. Greg observed trains that, by rushing to cover more miles each day, suffered accidents that could have been avoided, arriving in Santa Fe weeks behind their original schedule. He encountered one party that had lost an entire wagon when a wheel broke in the darkened, the wagon rolled into a gully, the driver had failed to see in time. The cargo was salvageable but scattered, the wagon too badly damaged to repair on the spot. The delay of redistributing the cargo and sending a man back to the nearest settlement for a replacement will cost them nearly 2 weeks. Greg described meeting other wagon trains at waypoints on the trail, comparing progress and sharing information about conditions ahead. These encounters revealed that despite different starting points, cargoes, and final destinations, all parties followed essentially the same schedule. All stopped as dusk approached, all resumed at dawn. The trail itself reinforced this rhythm. There were established campsites, places with water and relatively level ground, spaced roughly a day's travel apart. The goal of a party was to reach these points before dark, and even if they arrived early, they would stop rather than press on to an uncertain location ahead. These known campsites had been used for years, worn smooth by previous travelers, fire rings marked by old ashes, the best places to park wagons determined by collective experience. This created a structure for the journey, a series of fixed points between which travel occurred. Greg could plan his trip not as continuous movement, but as a series of legs connecting these known stopping points. The night camps became temporary communities, multiple trains gathering if their travel overlapped. The landscape became dotted with campfires, small circles of light separated by dark, each party maintaining its own space but aware of the presence of others nearby. This proximity brought comfort, even without interaction. Knowing others were enduring the same night, facing the same cold, dark, and discomfort, made the experience feel less isolated. He wrote that he often felt he could sleep better when the fires of other camps were visible. A distant fire represented human presence, a reminder that the landscape that seemed so vast and empty in the dark was being traversed by others struggling with the same problems, employing the same solutions. Occasionally, members of different trains would visit each other, sharing news or trading small items. These exchanges were brief, constrained by each person's need to rest and prepare for the next day's travel. But they provided moments of connection that broke the isolation of the trail. The morning was always cold, regardless of season. The pre-dawn air held a chill that penetrated clothes and blankets, and the effort of rising and preparing to move required forcing the body into action before it felt ready. Craig described this as the worst part of each day, not the night itself, but the transition from night to travel, when every part of the body wanted to remain still, conserve heat. The first movements were painful, muscles stiff from sleeping on hard ground, fingers clumsy with cold, struggling to complete the tasks of breaking camp. But motion eventually brought its own warmth, and as the sun rose and the day took shape around them, the discomfort of the night began to fade into memory. The rhythm of travel re-established itself. The creak of axles, the steady pace of walking or riding, the landscape slowly passing. The appearance of the sun changed everything, not only because of the warmth it brought, but because it restored the world's clear outlines. Features that were invisible or vague in darkness became clearly defined. The path ahead was discernible, the terrain readable, distances to landmarks measurable rather than guessed. Until dusk approached again, the light began its inevitable fade, and the same calculations began again: how far to the next known stop, how much light remained, when to make the decision to cease forward motion and prepare for another night. The periodicity of this decision-making became so ingrained that Greg could sense the appropriate stopping time without conscious calculation. His body and mind had become attuned to the angle of the sun and the texture of the light. Greg's diaries span years of these journeys, and the repetition in the records is not a failure of narrative, but a true reflection of the experience. Each night was similar to the last. Each stop followed the same pattern. Each dawn brought the same reluctant rising and return to travel. Over those years he aged, and the later records mention that the hardships he had once endured more easily now left him exhausted and slow to recover. The cold affected him more deeply. The hard ground made sleep more difficult. The rhythm that had once been merely uncomfortable became actively painful. His knees troubled him particularly, the constant walking combined with the jolting of the wagon taking a toll on joints, and never had time to properly recover between journeys. He wrote of mornings that required several minutes of slow movement to stand, his legs refusing to cooperate immediately after hours curled under a wagon. Yet he still traveled, because the trail connected him to markets and opportunities not available at home. The nightly stop remained an unnecessary part of every journey, hours subtracted from progress, essential to survival. The goods he traded, textiles, tools, manufactured goods from eastern states, could only reach the markets in Santa Fe by being hauled across the prairie, and someone had to do the hauling. The alternative was to abandon raid entirely, accept a smaller, more constrained life limited to what could be produced or obtained locally. In his last years of active trading, Greg wrote of the night camps with a weary acceptance. He no longer described them with the observational curiosity of his earlier diaries, but simply recorded them as facts camped at such minus and minus such place, or weather clear, moved on at dawn. The simplification of language reflected the depletion of energy. He had nothing new to say about the experience because the experience had not changed. Only his capacity to endure it had diminished. The stopping points were the same stopping points, the dark the same dark, the cold the same cold he had felt on his first crossing decades earlier. When he finally ceased traveling the trail, it was not because he had conquered or mastered it, but because his body could no longer sustain the repetition. The journey had not become easier with experience. He had only accumulated enough knowledge to minimize its costs while accepting that costs would always be extracted. His diaries end without drama, without a final grand journey or reflective summary. Just as each day's travel stopped when darkness made continuing impossible, his records simply cease. This abruptness is revealing in itself, suggesting that Greg saw no particular significance in the cessation of his travels beyond the fact that he could no longer make them. There was no sense of completion, only of arriving at a point where continuation was impossible. Other records, similar rhythms. Other travelers left similar records, though few as detailed as Greg's letters home, diary entries, the occasional published account, all describing the same pattern of movement and stop, the same rhythm determined by light and dark. A woman traveling with her family to the Oregon country wrote that in the evenings the children would ask how much farther, and she had no answer for them beyond "we'll go on again tomorrow." Progress was invisible within the journey, only measurable in retrospect, looking back over weeks at the accumulation of these small daily advances. She described how the children adapted to the routine more easily than the adults, accepting the pattern of stop and go as natural, not questioning why they couldn't simply travel until they arrived. For the children, each campsite was its own complete, self-contained little world, not a pause in a larger process. They found ways to make the nightly stop approximate normalcy, claiming specific spots by the fire, developing small rituals around the simple meals that could be cooked over an open flame. The children's ability to find satisfaction in these moments comforted her and troubled her. Comforted because they were not suffering as she had feared. They might troubled because it meant they were growing accustomed to this hard, rootless life. The adults carried the burden of understanding how much farther remained, how many more nights on the ground, how many more mornings of forcing a cold body into motion. This knowledge did not make them better travelers, only made them more aware of what they were enduring. Her husband calculated the miles covered and remaining himself, repeating the tally each night as they made camp. She noticed that after a few weeks, he stopped sharing the numbers with her, perhaps realizing the information brought no comfort, only made clearer how much suffering remained. The records of a military courier traveling between frontier forts reveal an efficiency born of repetition. His entries note only basic facts: departed at dawn, reached such minus and minus such creek at midday, camped at such minus and minus such place. The stops were functional, stripped of commentary, simply things that had to be done. But even in these bare facts, the pattern is visible: the regular stops, the timing to reach camps while there was still enough light to see, the acceptance that the message would arrive when it arrived, and no night travel would change that timeline significantly. The courier's diary occasional notes delays, whether that halted travel, a lame horse requiring rest, illness that forced him to stop for days. These interruptions are recorded in the same emotionally neutral tone as the successful travel days, suggesting a mindset that accepted both progress and setback as inevitable parts of the work. A circuit-riding minister, traveling between scattered settlements, wrote of using the nightly stops for prayer and reflection, trying to derive some meaning from the enforced stillness. He described how in these moments his thoughts turned to theological questions about the relationship between time and purpose, about what it meant to spend so much of a life waiting for dawn. His reflections brought no conclusions, only more questions. The nightly stop became a meditation, though not a peaceful one, on discomfort, the limits of the body, the vast distance between where he was and where he needed to be. He tried to frame the experience as a spiritual exercise, viewing the hardship as a kind of asceticism that might bring him closer to understanding divine will. That honesty forced him to admit in his records that most of the time he was simply cold, tired, and wishing to be elsewhere, and these feelings seemed to have no particular spiritual meaning beyond revealing his own weakness. All these accounts, different in their details and purposes, converge on the same basic truth: night ends, travel, day resumes it. The roads exist only in daylight. In darkness, they become zones of uncertainty, best avoided. The rhythm of the stop shaped not only the logistics of travel, but its psychology. You could not think of the journey as a continuous line from start to finish. You had to think of it as segments bounded by the stops. The journey was not one thing, but many things, a series of days separated by nights of interrupted continuity. This fragmentation made it difficult to maintain a continuous sense of purpose. Each morning required a renewed commitment to continue, a decision to resume rather than simply stay put. It made the distance feel longer, heavier. When you measured progress in stops rather than miles, when each day's travel ended with the same discomforts and difficulties, the accumulation of distance felt slow and grudging, not natural. The psychological effect of this rhythm varied among travelers. Some found the structured predictability comforting, a reliable pattern that reduced uncertainty, even as it prolonged the journey's duration. Others chafed at the enforced pauses, frustrated that the destination remained fixed while they were forced to stop merely for lack of light. And yet, people kept traveling, because the connections between places required someone to cross the distance between them. Messages delivered, goods traded, families relocated, obligations fulfilled. All of it required people to undertake these journeys, however difficult they were. The alternative was isolation, settlements cut off from each other, knowledge, goods, and people confined to where they were. The trail and all its hardships represented connection, difficult and expensive connection, but connection nonetheless. The nightly stop was where the price of that connection became most visible, paid in cold, discomfort, and sleep slins for the privilege of moving between 2 points. That the price was paid by every traveler, every night, on every road. The cumulative effect of these payments was a debt carried in the body: chronic fatigue, persistent minor ailments, premature aging imposed by the hard travel on those who did it frequently. Later photographs of Greg show a man who looked older than his years, his face weathered, his posture holding the permanent stiffness of too many nights on hard ground, until morning came, and the payment paused, and the rhythm of travel resumed its daytime pattern. Dawn represented not an earned rest, but a temporary respite from one kind of hardship to face the different hardship of forward motion. The cycle repeated day after day, until either the destination arrived or the ability to continue gave out. For most travelers, the destination arrived first, allowing them to tell themselves they had succeeded. The journey had been worth its cost. But the memory of the nightly stops remained, a deep understanding of what travel required, that could not be forgotten or romanticized. Those who made the trail only once often chose never to make it again if they could avoid it. Those who repeated the journeys did so from necessity, not desire. Josiah Gregg's account of the Santa Fe Rail is one of our most complete records of what overland travel meant in practical, daily terms. His meticulous recording of the mundane stopping times, camp routines, minor injuries, and constant discomfort corrects the more dramatic narratives that dominated popular accounts of Western travel at the time. For others wrote of adventure and danger, hostile encounters and dramatic scenery. Gregg wrote of calculating when to stop moving. Where others emphasized the heroic aspects of overland travel, he emphasized its monotony, repetition, and uncomfortable reality. This difference in perspective came not from timidity or lack of imagination, but from a clear understanding of what made a journey successful. The dramatic moments were often disastrous. The ordinary decisions correctly repeated day after day were what brought travelers to their destination intact. The nightly stop embodied this principle. They were not exciting, not memorable in themselves, not the stuff of adventure tales, but they were essential, and handling them correctly meant the difference between arriving safely and not. In this sense, Gregg's focus on the nightly stop was not a failure to recognize the more dramatic aspects of life on the trail, but a recognition that survival depended on successfully managing the undramatic. The trail did not take lives through spectacular disasters so much as through the accumulated effect of small failures: pushing too hard, stopping too late, failing to prepare adequately for the night. His diary tells us that distance was conquered not through boldness, but through sustainable routine, not through heroic effort, through patient acceptance of limitation. In the hundreds of repetitions over multiple journeys, the 2 hours of light left to establish a proper camp contained more practical wisdom than any single dramatic decision ever could. Archaeological footprints. In a way, the places where travelers stopped for the night have an archaeological quality to them. Over years, decades, centuries, even layers of presence accumulate. The same camping spots are used again and again, marked not by signs or buildings but by location along the route, the presence of water or shelter, or simply some quality that made stopping there feel natural. These places can still be found, if you know what to look for: ground packed hard by countless feet and wheels, stones arranged for a fire ring and rearranged by each new party of travelers, trees where horses would either travelers carved names to prove they had passed through. The archaeological record of travel is largely a record of stops. The act of moving forward through space, these little trace a wheel pressed into mud hardens, weathers, disappears, footprints fade. But stopping produces accumulation, the ash of campfires, broken tools or discarded items, animal bones from meals, the worn minus down evidence of repeated human activity. These concentrations of material culture form islands of evidence in a landscape where the movement itself has become invisible. Excavations at known stopping points along frontier roads reveal this layering with remarkable consistency. Deeper soil holds artifacts from earlier periods, the more recent surface layers contain items marking later use. But the pattern remains the same over time. People stopped at these places because these places offered what travelers needed. Therefore, the same locations drew travelers century after century. The logic of a good stopping point transcended the specific technology or culture of any single era. Water was often the deciding factor, a single need that could not be compromised or substituted. A spring, a creek, a reliable source of water for people and animals, made a location valuable. Travelers planned their daily mileage to reach these sources before dark, and these sites became nodes in a network of known stopping points. This network was passed on by word of mouth, recorded in traveler diaries, marked on hand, minus drawn maps circulated among those planning westward journeys. But water alone was not enough to make a site suitable for the nightly camps that structured frontier travel. The ground needed to be relatively level for sleeping and parking wagons. Trees or rock formations that offered some shelter from wind were preferred, a natural barrier that could mean a difference between a night that was barely tolerable and one that was truly miserable. The location needed to be close enough to the road to be found by travelers as light failed, but far enough away that the road itself did not run directly through the camp. These requirements created a specific geography of stopping points, not random spots along the road, but carefully chosen locations that met multiple criteria. A site might have good water but be exposed, might have excellent shelter but be difficult to access, might have level ground but no protection from wind. Over time, as more travelers used these sites, they became established through use, not through any official designation. The accumulation of fire rings, the clearing of brush, the paths worn between the road and the water source, all these modifications made it easier for each subsequent party of travelers to recognize and use the site. Darkness in different knowledge systems. The indigenous peoples who lived in these regions had their own understanding of night travel, passed down through generations and based on intimate knowledge of the terrain. Their knowledge was different from that of the settlers and traders who came later along the roads. It was knowledge of the land itself, of how to read it in the dark, of which routes could be safely traveled in poor light. But even with this deeper knowledge, the pattern of stopping remained. Night travel was not impossible, but it required conditions. Most journeys did not have familiarity with a specific terrain, clear skies for navigation by stars, a compelling reason to travel that outweighed the value of waiting for dawn. Oral histories preserved by some indigenous communities describe night travel as something done only when necessary and with specific precautions. Travelers would move slowly, testing each step, maintaining a constant awareness of their surroundings through sound and feel rather than sight. The techniques described in these oral traditions reveal a sophisticated understanding of how human perception works in darkness. Eyes can be trained to detect subtle variations in shadow, to distinguish the dark of open space from the dark of solid obstruction. But it requires patience and practice, and few possessed it. These stories also contain warnings about the dangers of night movement, the ease of becoming disoriented, the inability to see hazards, the way arc turns a familiar landscape into a place of uncertainty. The warnings are pragmatic, not supernatural, based on accumulated experience of what could go wrong when continuing to move without visual confirmation. The consistency of these warnings across different tribal traditions and different geographic regions suggests they arose from real, repeated experience, not superstition. When the same lessons appear in communities hundreds of miles apart, with different languages and different cultural frameworks, it indicates that all groups were responding to a common underlying reality. European settlers arriving in these areas brought their own beliefs about night travel, influenced by traditions from their homelands. Many of these beliefs contained a superstitious element. Crossroads were considered dangerous places to linger after dark. Certain hours of the night were thought more perilous than others. Specific landmarks were associated with disappearances or bad luck. These beliefs were seldom articulated by their holders as superstition, but as practical wisdom. Avoid crossroads because in the dark they are confusing and you might take the wrong road. Avoid the hours before dawn because that is when you are coldest and most vulnerable. Avoid certain landmarks because they are associated with difficult terrain or unreliable conditions. Whether the reasoning was supernatural or practical, the result was the same. Travelers stopped and waited for light, rather than pushing on in darkness. These beliefs reinforced behavior that safety already demanded, creating a cultural consensus that extended beyond any single rationale. The limits of lanterns. Lanterns and torches existed, of course, and travelers carried them, but the light they provided was extremely limited. A lantern might illuminate a circle of ground 10 feet in diameter, less if the wind was strong or the fuel poor. Beyond that circle, the dark remained complete. Walking with a lantern created a small visible bubble that moved with you, but it also destroyed your night vision, making everything outside the bubble seem darker by contrast. As adapted to the bright flame could not then see the fainter variations in darkness that starlight or moonlight might provide. Pupils contracted by the fire, reducing the eye's ability to gather ambient light, and a lantern announced your presence to anyone or anything that might be watching. The light was visible at a distance far greater than the distance it projected. Useful illumination. A moving flame on a dark road might be seen half a mile away or more, marking the traveler's position and progress. This created a vulnerability that some travelers considered more worrisome than the dark itself. In areas where robbery was common or where relations between different groups were tense, the decision to travel with visible light became a calculation of comparative risk, not a simple choice between illumination and dark. Some travelers preferred to move without light, letting their eyes adapt to the dark, relying on the faint illumination of stars or moonlight when available. This allowed better peripheral awareness and made them less visible to others, but it also meant moving very slowly and accepting that most of the terrain was simply not visible. Neither method made night travel truly safe or efficient. Both were compromises, attempts to make movement possible under conditions that fundamentally did not support it. Both taught travelers through experience that it was far better to simply stop until daylight returned. These lessons were often learned the hard way through falls, becoming lost, encountering obstacles that would have been easily avoided by day. The archaeological evidence includes the remnants of the lanterns themselves, broken tin and glass, rusted metal frames, fragments of the tools travelers carried in the hope of extending the usable day. These artifacts are found at campsites, not along the road, suggesting they were used primarily for establishing camp, for illumination around the fire, not for extending travel into darkness. The pattern of their distribution tells a story about the actual use of light in frontier travel. Lanterns clustered around fire rings, indicating they were used for tasks around the camp, preparing meals, tending animals, sorting supplies, not for continuing down the road. The emergence of inns. Some stopping points evolved over time into more permanent presences. Locations where travelers regularly stopped developed inns, establishments that charged for a bed, a meal, and shelter. These inns were always spaced roughly a day's journey apart, situated at the natural stopping points travelers had used before any building existed. The proprietors who established these businesses recognized the patterns created by the accumulated behavior of travelers, and they positioned their enterprises to serve an already existing need. The presence of inns did not change the fundamental pattern. Travelers still stopped as dusk approached, still measured progress in days rather than continuous miles. But the inn made the stop more comfortable, provided walls and a roof and warmth that camping could not. The facilities were simple, usually a single large room where multiple travelers slept on cots or on the floor kitchen, where basic meals were prepared, perhaps a stable for animals. Comfort was relative. You were indoors instead of out, slightly warmer, slightly safer, but still sleeping in a room with strangers, still rising before dawn to continue. The social dynamics of these shared sleeping areas created their own patterns on etiquette. Travelers arranged themselves by party when possible, families taking corners, merchants sleeping near their goods, strangers maintaining a careful distance from each other in the crowded space. The inns themselves became landmarks, points of reference for measuring distance. 2 days from Miller's Inn meant something specific to anyone traveling that road about 40 miles, given the conditions, divided into two roughly equal segments. Between inns, travelers relied on established camps or, when necessary, found their own stopping points. Maps of frontier roads would show the inns as bright points along the route, the spaces between them filled with less formal stopping points used as needed. Not all roads had inns. Routes with less traffic, roads passing through regions too remote or too dangerous to support permanent facilities, offered only what the landscape itself gave. Travelers on these roads carried more supplies, endured more discomfort, measured the journey in longer units of time. The difference between traveling a road with established inns and one without could be significant, not only in comfort but in the supplies that needed to be carried and the planning required before setting out. The cultural understanding of a road included this temporal dimension. A road was not only a path through space, but a structure that existed fully only during certain hours. After dark, the road became something else, became untrustworthy, best avoided until light restored its character as a route rather than a risk. This understanding was so deeply embedded in the culture of travel that it shaped language. The phrase to make camp carried no connotation of failure or setback. It was simply the natural and necessary thing to do when traveling, as natural as traveling itself. A day's journey did not end when you reached your destination because most days you did not reach your destination. A day's journey ended when darkness forced you to stop. This rhythm created a different relationship to time than we have in modern travel, where the destination is the expected endpoint and stopping early is seen as delay or failure. Questions about distance were answered not in miles, but in days. How far to the next settlement? 3 days if the weather holds. The answer contained not only the physical distance but the rhythm of travel. 3 days of daytime movement, interrupted by 3 nights of stopping. The uncertainty inherent in these estimates was accepted as an intrinsic quality of travel. Weather could slow progress, road conditions could change, animals could tire or go lame. 100 variables could extend or compress the time required. But the basic unit remained the day, the period of useful light. This way of measuring distance reflected a fundamental truth of frontier travel. The constraints were temporal as well as spatial, and any estimate had to account for both. 20 miles of good road in summer might indeed be a day's travel, while the same distance in winter over difficult terrain might require 2 days, or even 3. A vanished rhythm in the landscape. Today, most of these old roads are gone. Some lie under pavement, modern highways built over their approximate paths, but many frontier routes have returned to forest or prairie, their exact locations lost except where historical maps and archaeological evidence intersect. Walking these vanished roads today, you might pass within feet of places where hundreds of travelers spent the night without knowing it. The landscape has absorbed the roads into itself, erased the paths that seemed so permanent to those who walked them. But sometimes, the landscape still holds signs of depression where the ground was packed hard, a line of stones that once formed a fire ring, a tree with old scars from where horses were tied. The traces are faint, easily overlooked. Meaningful only if you know what you are looking at and what it represents. Archaeologists trained to read these signs can reconstruct patterns of use from subtle variations in soil composition and artifact distribution. But to the untrained eye, these sites are indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. As roads improved and technology changed, The cultural memory of avoiding night travel gradually faded. Electric lights, paved surfaces, reliable vehicles, these turned roads from places that existed only by day into routes passable at any hour. Darkness ceased to be a boundary that ended movement. The shift was gradual and uneven, city roads changing first, country roads following years or decades later. But the overall trajectory was clear and eventually became universal. Yet, for more than a century, during which frontier travel dominated the westward movement in America, the pattern was absolute. Night meant stop, day meant go, and this alternating rhythm shaped every journey undertaken. The stopping points themselves became part of the infrastructure of expansion, as essential as the roads they served. Without places where a traveler could stop safely, longer routes would have been impossible. The stopping points made the roads practical, turned them from theoretical lines on a map into routes actual people could traverse. A road without adequate stopping points was not, whatever the map said, a truly usable road. Understanding this pattern requires accepting that travel was primarily not about movement, but about the relationship between movement and rest, progress and pause, the hours when the road was usable and the hours when it was not. The stopping points were not interruptions to travel, they were indispensable components of it. Modern thinking about travel often glorifies movement, sees stopping as delay or failure, measures a journey by the distance covered rather than by the full cycle of movement undressed that made sustained travel possible. Frontier travelers had no such illusion. They understood that stopping was not the opposite of travel, but one of its necessary phases. Today, if you can find these old stopping places, if you can recognize the layers of time covering them, standing in these spots is to stand in a space defined by waiting. Not dramatic waiting, not waiting filled with fear or anticipation, but simply waiting for dawn, for light, for the road to become visible and trustworthy again. The darkness that made these places necessary still falls each night, still turns visibility uncertainty into ambiguity and doubt. But we no longer stop when it comes, no longer accept its authority over movement. Roads are kept visible now by artificial light, kept passable by technologies our unaided senses cannot provide. A headlight pierces the dark, streetlights create corridors of visibility. GPS systems allow navigation without visual reference to terrain, eliminating the need for the kind of stops that once structured all travel. Whether this is progress or merely a different set of compromises is perhaps a matter for each person to decide. But the historical fact remains for generations of travelers. Darkness absolutely ended the day's journey, and the places where they stopped became as important as the distance they covered. Privilege and exception. Not everyone stopped at dark. A small category of travelers continued to move at night, treating the road as something usable regardless of light, possessing resources that turned dark from an absolute barrier into a manageable difficulty. These individuals were not more courageous or skilled, their status gave them advantages ordinary travelers did not have. Thims, military couriers carrying messages between forts and outposts sometimes traveled on schedules that required night movement. They rode alone or in pairs, moving quickly on horseback, carrying dispatches commanders considered urgent enough to justify the risk of darkness. These riders had several advantages civilians lacked. They knew the route extremely well, riding the same path repeatedly until every landmark and turn was memorized. They carried minimal supplies, prioritizing speed over comfort, accepting hardship as part of the duty. Their saddles were equipped with specially designed mail bags to keep documents dry and secure. Their horses were chosen for endurance and reliability, not appearance. Most importantly, they had a destination that would receive them whenever they arrived. A Fort military outpost was manned at night. Gates could be opened for an expected arrival, and the courier knew that reaching his destination meant shelter, food, and rest. But even these military riders stopped when they could. Records of the courier service show night travel was used only when necessary, when orders specify information must arrive by a certain time, when weather or other delays had used up the daylight hours, when the nature of the message made speed critical. The courier's diaries, when they kept them, described night riding as disorienting and exhausting even on familiar routes. Landmarks they relied on by day became difficult to identify in darkness. Horses moved more cautiously, uncertain of their footing, requiring constant guidance from the rider. The animals' ears would swivel constantly, processing sounds the rider could barely hear, staying alert to dangers still unseen. Stagecoach drivers represented a commercial version of these pressures. Stegecuos ran on published schedules, and passengers expected to arrive at stated times. This put pressure on the driver to keep moving, even when conditions were difficult. The companies that employed them emphasized reliability and punctuality, understanding their commercial success depended on meeting the expectations created by publishing a schedule. The stagecoach carried multiple passengers, making the driver's decisions affect not only himself but everyone on board. A driver who chose to stop early or travel slowly risked complaints from passengers eager to reach their destination. A driver who took risks to maintain the schedule might satisfy the passengers but endanger everyone. This tension between safety and service shaped every decision a stagecoach driver made, particularly as daylight faded and the choice to continue or stop became urgent. Privileged travelers, government officials, wealthy merchants, high-ranking clergy also moved, but under different conditions. They had resources and support systems that reduced, but did not eliminate, the risks of darkness. Their advantage lay in being able to choose better equipment, hire guides, rely on networks of hospitality along the way. Wealthy merchants' camp had guards on watch. An official could commandeer a homestead. A circuit-riding minister had congregations to receive him within his circuit. But these privileges did not break the basic pattern. Even the privileged avoided night travel when feasible. They stopped more comfortably, more safely, but they still stopped. The difference was in the quality of the stop, not its necessity. The merchant slept on a bedroll in a tent while the ordinary traveler wrapped in a thin blanket on hard ground, but both waited for dawn. Geographic regularity. Archaeological surveys of frontier regions reveal the density of these stopping points with remarkable consistency. On heavily traveled routes, signs of overnight camps appear every 15 to 20 miles, a distance representing a day's travel under typical conditions. The consistency of this spacing across different regions and periods suggests a fundamental limit to the distance a loaded wagon or a walking traveler could reasonably advance during the hours of daylight. This limit was not arbitrary but arose from the physiological capabilities of humans and draft animals combined with the number of useful hours the day provided in different seasons. The spaces between stopping points are largely devoid of artifacts. Occasional finds mark where something was lost or discarded during travel, but compared to the concentrations at camps, these are scattered and random. Archaeology confirms what the written records describe. Travel was movement between stopping points, not a continuous occupation of the road. The landscape of frontier travel was essentially binary, dense accumulations of material culture at the stops, sparse scatterings in between. The lost and the forgotten. Some mysteries remain in this landscape of stopping. Isolated sites show camps established in locations far from known stopping points, seemingly poorly chosen, no water nearby, exposed with no shelter, difficult terrain. These anomalies suggest emergencies, misjudgments, or parties that tried to go too far and were forced to stop exactly where darkness made further movement impossible. The artifacts at these sites sometimes show signs of haste, a fire built in a less minus than minus ideal spot, minimal organization of the camp, signs the travelers left as soon as light allowed. Other sites show evidence of journeys abandoned in mid-minus course, a wagon left by the road, supplies scattered, signs of a hasty departure. Some of these can be explained by known disasters, a weather event or an attack that caused the party to scatter. Others remain unexplained. Small mysteries preserved in the pattern of artifacts that suggest something went wrong but provide no clear narrative of events. These abandoned sites create an eerie category in frontier archaeology, places where the normal pattern of stopping was interrupted by something anomalous. But the precise nature of the interruption is lost to time. Modern thinking about travel often glorifies movement, sees stopping as delay or failure, measures a journey by the distance covered rather than by the full cycle of movement, undress that made sustained travel possible. Frontier travelers had no such illusion. They understood that stopping was not the opposite of travel, but one of its necessary phases. Standing in these old stopping places, if you can find them, if you can recognize them in the layers of time covering them, is to stand in a space defined by waiting. Dramatic waiting, not waiting for dawn, for light, for the road to become visible and trustworthy again. The darkness that made these places necessary still falls each night, still turns visibility, uncertainty into ambiguity and doubt. But we no longer stop when it comes, no longer accept its authority over movement. Roads are kept visible now by artificial light, kept passable by technologies our unaided senses cannot provide. Headlights pierce the dark, streetlights create corridors of visibility. GPS systems allow navigation without visual reference to terrain, eliminating the need for the kind of stops that once structured all travel. Whether this is progress or merely a different set of compromises is perhaps a matter for each person to decide, but the historical fact remains for generations of travelers. Darkness absolutely ended the day's journey, and the places where they stopped became as important as the distance they covered. The journey's end. We have traveled together now in the failing light, in the company of those who measured a journey not by miles conquered through determination, but by safe havens found before sunset. The road, so clearly present in daylight, disappeared when darkness fell, not because the physical path vanished, but because the certainty it provided could not survive without light. Take a moment to think of the distance we have covered tonight, not in space, but in understanding. We began with a simple fact: travelers stopped at sunset. We have seen how this simple fact shaped everything about the experience of travel, the planning, the rhythm, the infrastructure, even the language used to describe distance and progress. The travelers we have accompanied, the ordinary men and women making camp, Josiah Gregg recording the stops on the Santa Fe rail, the communities that gathered at established stopping points, the few privileged who still acknowledge darkness as a boundary despite their support. They all accepted something we have largely forgotten: that movement through space is primarily not about will or determination, but about operating within the limits imposed by the physical world. Darkness was such a limit, as absolute as a mountain range or an ocean. You could not decide to overcome it through effort or courage alone. You could only accept it, plan around it, wait for the conditions that made movement possible to return. There is something almost peaceful in that acceptance, in the recognition that some things cannot be forced or rushed. The travelers stopped because to continue was foolish, and in stopping, they aligned themselves with a natural rhythm older than roads, older than wheels, older than any human invention designed to speed movement through space. We live now in an age when that rhythm has been broken. The artificial light has extended our useful hours far beyond what the sun gives. Roads are marked, illuminated, made passable at any hour. We can choose to travel at night, and we often do, measuring progress in continuous motion rather than in the stops that once structured every journey. This is progress, surely, to be able to move regardless of light, to arrive more quickly, to be less subject to the constraints that governed our ancestors. These are real advantages that have reshaped our relationship to distance and time. But something has also been lost, though lost may not be quite right. Something has become invisible to us: the understanding that movement undressed were not opposites but partners, the recognition that stopping was not failure but wisdom, the sense that the dark that ended each day's travel was not an enemy to be defeated but a condition to be respected. The travelers who stopped when the light became insufficient were not weak or timid. They were practical, experienced, clear about what their bodies and animals could endure, what the road could support. They knew that the miles gained by continuing in darkness would be paid for many times over in exhaustion, in accidents, and the sheer stress of navigating uncertainty under conditions that made navigation unreliable. Their stopping points, scattered across the landscape at intervals determined by the length of the day and the distance that could be covered, created a geography of rest. These places were not destinations, but pauses; not achievements, but necessities. Yet, in their accumulation, they shaped the experience of travel as much as the road itself did. Imagine yourself once more in such a stopping place. The campfire is low, tended carefully to provide warmth and light without consuming its fuel too quickly. The dark press is close, just beyond the small circle of light. Your body is tired from the day's movement, but sleep is slow to come because the ground is hard, the cold persistent, the sounds of the night constantly pulling your attention to the periphery. You are uncomfortable, of course. You would rather be in a bed at your destination, warm and safe. But you are also doing exactly what the situation requires, waiting for conditions to change, preserving your energy for tomorrow's movement, accepting the rhythm that travel imposes. There is a wisdom in this that our current approach to travel has largely discarded. He pushed forward regardless of conditions, force movement when perhaps rest would be wiser, measure success by distance covered rather than by a sustainable pace. The travelers who stopped each night understood something we have forgotten, that the journey is not separate from the stops, that progress includes periods of stillness, and that the ability to arrive safely depends as much on knowing when to stop moving as on knowing when to start. Tonight, wherever you are hearing these words, as you settle into rest, you are practicing your own version of what those travelers did each evening. You were stopping, ceasing the day's movement and activity, accepting that some hours are meant for stillness, not progress. Your bed is softer than the ground they slept on, your room warmer than their camps. You are safer, more comfortable, more secure in 100 ways. But the fundamental act is the same, acknowledging that body and mind require rest, that some form of stop is necessary for any journey to continue. The roads those travelers used are mostly gone now, returned to forest, paved over, or simply forgotten as new routes replace them. The patterns they created, the movement and the stop, the progress and the rest, the rhythm of the day built by light and dark, remain embedded in our understanding of journeys and destinations. We measure our own travels differently now, in hours not days, in continuous motion, not accumulated stops. But underneath our changed methods, the old truth remains: no journey proceeds without pause, no movement continues forever, no progress is made that does not require periods of rest that allow progress to resume. The travelers who avoided the road after dark were not shunning adventure or evading challenge. They were simply being realistic about what could be accomplished in darkness and what should wait for light. They prioritized survival over speed, sustainability over heroic effort, the completion of the journey over the conquest of any single day. Their nightly camps were small concessions to limitation, admissions that human capacity has its boundaries and wisdom respects rather than challenges those boundaries. And in the morning, when those limitations lifted with the returning light, the travelers resumed their forward motion without drama or announcement, simply because the road had become safe to travel again. This pattern repeated on the frontier roads, across generations, across thousands of miles, across countless individual journeys undertaken for different reasons. The details varied, but the rhythm held constant: move when you can see, stop when darkness makes seeing impossible, rest until light returns, then move again. We have followed that rhythm together tonight, moving through paragraphs and stories, pausing to consider details, then continuing forward in the narrative. Now we have reached our own stopping point, this particular journey through history arriving at its natural pause. The travelers are still out there in a sense, not literally, not alive, but present in the traces they left, the patterns they established, the understanding they developed about what travel required and what darkness demanded. Their experience is distant from ours in time and comfort, but not in its fundamental truths. They knew something worth remembering: that movement is not always possible, that some conditions require waiting, that the dark that ends each day is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be accepted. They stopped when stopping was wise, and in doing so, they survived to continue the journey. As you drift now toward your own rest, let the image of those travelers settling into their evening camps accompany you. See them arranging their small fire, pulling tight against the cold, accepting discomfort because it is temporary and necessary. Listen to the sounds they heard: the wind in the trees, the crackle of the flame, the distant cry of an animal moving in the dark. Feel the hardness of the ground beneath them, the chill in the air, the weight of the day's accumulated fatigue, and also the slow release of tension as the body acknowledges that movement is over, that this night will pass as all nights pass, and that morning will come, and with it the resumption of forward progress. The road is still out there in the dark, invisible but present, waiting to be walked when light returns. The destination is still ahead, no closer than it was at dark, but no farther away. Time passes through the night, but the journey itself is suspended, held in the hours when movement cannot safely continue. In that suspension and that waiting, there is a kind of peace. Not the peace of completion or arrival, but the peace of acceptance. This is where you are. This is when rest comes. Tomorrow will be different. but tonight is for stillness. The travelers understood this. They did not fight the dark, did not resent the stop it demanded. They simply stopped, made what preparations they could for the night to come, and waited, with whatever patience they could muster, for the conditions that would allow them to continue. You can do the same now. The journey you are on, whatever that journey is, whatever destination you are working to reach, will still be there tomorrow. Tonight is for rest, for the kind of stop those travelers practiced each evening, for acknowledging that forward movement is not always possible and should not always be forced. Let the dark be what it was for them, not an enemy or an obstacle, but simply a condition that calls for different behavior, for stillness instead of movement, for rest instead of progress. Let tonight be a stopping point, a pause between today's movement and tomorrow's. The campfires are going out now in those long minus-ago camps, burning down to embers that glow faintly in the dark. The travelers are settling into whatever sleep the conditions allow. Their bodies are finding whatever comfort can be found on hard ground, their minds releasing the day's concerns, drifting into the shapeless space between waking and sleep. You can join that drifting. Let your own thoughts become as vague as theirs. Let the boundary between consciousness and sleep become as blurred as the boundary between firelight and the surrounding dark. There is nothing more that needs doing tonight. No distance that must be covered. No decision that cannot wait for morning. The road will still be there when the light returns. The journey will continue when continuation becomes possible. But for now, there is only this: the stop, the wait, the slow surrender to rest that every traveler must make when darkness falls and the road disappears into the night. Sleep well, traveler. Morning will come as it always does, and with it the light that makes movement possible again. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight belongs to rest, to the stop that sustains all journeys, to the dark that teaches us when to cease pushing forward and simply be still. The campfires are going out now, one by one, in the camps scattered across a landscape that now exists only in memory and trace. The travelers are finding what sleep they can. The night is long but not endless. Dawn will come, but it is not here yet. For now, only silence, dark waiting. Let yourself wait with them. Let yourself stop as they did. Let yourself rest as they rested. The road can wait. Tomorrow can wait. Everything can wait when the dark comes down.